Have you ever wondered how far a man can go when left with nothing but his instinct and his fury? Picture this, a pilot, someone who soared the skies for Pablo Escobar, carrying his empire on the wings of his small plane. He was a trusted man, someone who knew the cartel's secrets better than many of its lieutenants. But one night, in the middle of the deepest, darkest jungle, everything he had built came crashing down. They abandoned him, betrayed him, left him for dead among the shadows of the trees and the roars of the beasts. However, what he did next not only defied all expectations, but made the toughest men in drug trafficking tremble. This is a story of survival, of revenge, and of a comeback nobody saw coming. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will take you to the edge of the abyss and won't let you go until the very end. It was April 1989, and the Medellin cartel was in full expansion. Pablo Escobar ruled Colombia like a king without a crown, and his operations extended beyond its borders, reaching the United States and further. But to keep that empire running, he needed men like Javier El Halcon Morales. Javier wasn't a hitman or a common trafficker. He was a pilot, one of the best. Just over 30, he had dark, messy hair, a trimmed beard that gave him a wild look, and eyes that seemed to see right through the clouds. He had flown hundreds of missions for Escobar, carrying cocaine from the depths of the Colombian jungles to clandestine airstrips in Central America. His hands were steady on the controls, his mind cool under pressure. Escobar called him "my right wing," and that made him untouchable, or so he thought. That night, the mission seemed routine. Javier received a direct order from Escobar. Take off from a hidden airstrip in Antioquia, load a 2-ton shipment of cocaine, and deliver it to a makeshift runway in Honduras. The plan was simple: fly low to avoid radar, land before dawn, unload with the local crew, and return home with a briefcase full of dollars. He had made this trip dozens of times, and although the risk was always present, he trusted his skill and the cartel's protection. He climbed into his Cessna 182, an old but reliable plane, checked the instruments by flashlight, and took off as the moon barely peeked through the clouds. The flight started smoothly. The engine roared powerfully, and the landscape below was a sea of darkness dotted by the distant lights of some forgotten town. Javier kept the altitude low, barely skimming the treetops, sweat running down his forehead. He knew any mistake could mean a crash or capture, but he also knew the payout was worth it. Escobar had promised him a special bonus this time, something about a secure future. Javier smiled to himself, imagining a quieter life after a few more years in the business. But then something changed. Midway through the journey, while flying over a dense jungle on the border between Colombia and Panama, the panel lights started flickering. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died completely. Javier cursed under his breath, wrestling with the controls as the plane rapidly lost altitude. There was no time for panic. He'd been trained for this. He looked for a clearing among the trees, any place he could attempt an emergency landing. He found one, a strip of land barely visible in the moonlight. Hands gripping the yoke, heart in his throat, he managed to bring the plane down with a hard thud that shook his entire body. The fuselage groaned, the wings bent against the trees, but he was alive. When the dust settled, Javier climbed out of the cockpit, legs trembling but intact. The jungle surrounded him like a living wall. Tall trees blocking the sky, the constant buzz of insects, and the distant roar of something he couldn't identify. He checked the engine, expecting to find a mechanical failure that explained the disaster, but what he saw froze him. The fuel lines had been cut, not by accident, but with precision, as if someone had sabotaged them before takeoff. This wasn't a failure. This was a trap. Before he could process it, he heard the sound of boots crushing branches. 3 men emerged from the darkness, armed with rifles and flashlights that blinded him. One of them, a skinny guy with a worn cap, stepped forward and pointed his weapon directly at Javier's head. "End of the road, Halcon," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Javier recognized the man instantly. It was Rafael, a low-ranking trafficker who had worked the cartel's air routes. The other two were strangers, but their looks said the same thing. There was no escape. "What's going on?" Javier asked, slowly raising his hands. Rafael smirked, a twisted grin that didn't reach his eyes. "New orders. Someone decided you know. Too much. The boss doesn't need you anymore." Javier felt a knot in his stomach. Escobar? No, that didn't make sense. He was loyal, had risked his life time and again for the cartel. But before he could protest, Rafael gave a signal, and one of the men struck him on the head with the butt of his rifle. Everything went black. If this story is already getting your nerves on edge, don't leave this video. What comes next is madness you won't believe. And I promise, if you stay until the end, you'll see how an abandoned man becomes a nightmare for his betrayers. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and get ready, because this is just beginning. When Javier opened his eyes, the sun was barely filtering through the treetops. He was lying on the damp earth, his head throbbing, his mouth full of blood. His hands instinctively searched for his weapon, but it wasn't there. He struggled to his feet, staggering as the world spun around him. The plane was a few meters away, wrecked but mostly intact, and the cocaine shipment was gone. The men had left, taking everything and leaving him there to die. There was no trace of them, only the oppressive silence of the jungle and the buzzing of mosquitoes already starting to swarm him. Javier leaned against a tree, breathing heavily as he tried to understand what had happened. Rafael had said new orders, but from whom? Escobar wouldn't betray him like this. He was too valuable. Then an idea struck him like lightning. This didn't come from the boss. Someone inside the cartel, someone with power, had decided to eliminate him. Maybe Gustavo Gaviria, who had never trusted the pilots. Or perhaps El Tigre Montoya, an ambitious lieutenant who saw Javier as a threat. Whoever it was, they had made one mistake. They left him alive. There was no time to waste. The jungle was a deadly place, and if he wanted to survive, he had to move. He checked the plane for anything useful. He found a half-full canteen, a rusty machete under the seat, and a crumpled map showing the air routes. No food, no firearm. But he had his instinct and a fury that grew with every second. "They're going to pay," he muttered through gritted teeth, and started walking, hacking branches with the machete as the sun climbed higher. The first few days were hell. The jungle showed no mercy. The heat suffocated him. The humidity stuck his clothes to his skin, and every step was a battle against roots and mud. The noises kept him awake at night. Roars of jaguars, screeches of monkeys, the rustling of something moving in the dark. He found a stream on the second day and drank until he was full. But food was another problem. He used the machete to cut wild fruits, some bitter but edible. On one occasion he caught a small snake and roasted it over a makeshift fire. Every bite was a reminder of his goal: survive, return, and make them pay. On the third day, he found human tracks, fresh footprints. In the mud, an empty bullet casing. He followed the trail cautiously, hiding among the trees whenever he heard a strange sound. The tracks led him to a makeshift camp. 3 armed men were laughing around a fire. Javier watched them from the shadows, his heart pounding as he recognized one of them, the bald man who had hit him. They were part of Rafael's team, probably waiting for rescue or making sure he hadn't survived. There was no room for doubt. Javier waited until midnight when the camp fell silent. He approached stealthily, machete in hand, breath held. The first man never saw him coming, a clean cut to the throat, and he fell without a sound. The second woke up feeling the movement, but before he could scream, Javier plunged the machete into his chest. The bald man was the last, opening his eyes just in time to see the blade descend. "This is for me," Javier whispered, leaving the bodies there, surrounded by blood and jungle. The encounter gave him more than just vengeance. A rifle, a pistol, and a walkie-talkie that still worked. He heard fragments of conversations on the device, confused orders, mentions of El Halcon and the lost cargo. It seemed the cartel didn't know if he was dead or alive, but they would soon find out. Javier took what he could carry and pushed on, guided by the map and the stars. He knew he was days away from any town, but every step brought him closer to his objective, Medellin, the heart of Escobar's empire, where he would find those responsible. The jungle remained relentless. A torrential downpour caught him on the 5th day, turning the ground into a swamp that reached his knees. Insects devoured him, leaving bites that burned like fire. Once, a jaguar stalked him for hours. Its yellow, eyes glowing in the dark, but Javier kept a fire going and scared it off with shots into the air. His body was at its limit, but his mind was sharper than ever. Every tree he cut, every kilometer he covered, was a step towards justice. He wasn't going to die there. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. After a week, he reached a wide, turbulent river. On the opposite bank, he saw smoke, a small village, probably a transit point for traffickers. Crossing wouldn't be easy. The water roared powerfully and he had no boat, but Javier hadn't come this far to give up. He tied the rifle and pistol to his back with strips of cloth torn from his shirt and plunged into the river, fighting the current with every fiber of his being. The waves dragged him, slammed him against rocks, but he kept swimming, grunting with each stroke until his hands touched the other shore. He fell to his knees, soaked and exhausted, but alive. The village was a miserable place, wooden shacks, skinny dogs barking, and hard-eyed men watching him as he approached. Javier knew he couldn't trust anyone, but he needed food and a plan. In a makeshift bar, he traded the walkie-talkie for a plate of chicken and rice and a shot of aguardiente. While eating, he overheard two men talking in low voices about a lost shipment and a pilot who disappeared in the jungle. He smiled to himself. He hadn't disappeared. He was about to reappear. With a full stomach and weapons hidden under a stolen jacket, Javier discreetly asked for a cartel contact. An old drunk, in exchange for a few coins, gave him a name, El Gordo Ramirez, a local trafficker who managed land routes to Medellin. Javier found him that night in a warehouse on the edge of town, surrounded by boxes and armed men. He wasted no time on pleasantries. When El Gordo saw him, he raised an eyebrow, confused. "Who are you?" he growled. Javier stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I'm the man you shouldn't have left alive." Before El Gordo could react, Javier pulled out his pistol and shot the nearest guard. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, the sound of splintering wood. Javier moved like a predator, using the boxes for cover as he eliminated the men one by one. El Gordo tried to flee, but Javier caught him, knocking him down with a blow from the pistol butt to his head. He demanded answers. "Who ordered the hit?" he snarled. El Gordo, trembling, confessed between gasps. "It was El Tigre Montoya. He said you were a risk. Knew too much about the routes." El Tigre. Javier knew him well, a cruel, ambitious lieutenant who had always envied his closeness to Escobar. Now it all made sense. With a final shot, he finished El Gordo and took the keys to a truck parked outside. The jungle was over. Now the real hunt began. If this story is making you break out in a cold sweat, don't go anywhere yet. What comes next is the heart of this comeback, and I swear you won't believe how it ends. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay till the end, because this pilot didn't give up, and his revenge is about to shake everything up. The journey back to Medellin took 3 days. Javier drove the truck along dusty roads, sleeping only a few hours in the seat, rifle within reach. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, his clothes in tatters. but his eyes shone with a determination nothing could extinguish. He knew facing El Tigre wouldn't be easy. The man had his own network of sicarios and a fortress on the outskirts of the city, but Javier wasn't going to attack head-on. He had learned something in the jungle. Patience and shadows were his best weapons. He arrived in Medellin at dusk, the sun painting the sky blood red. He hid the truck in a forgotten neighborhood and moved on foot, using alleys and old contacts to gather information. He discovered El Tigre was planning a meeting with other lieutenants at an estate outside the city, a place surrounded by guards and barbed wire. It was the perfect moment. All his enemies in one place, confident in their power. Javier spent 2 days preparing his attack, stealing gasoline from a nearby depot, getting homemade explosives from a street dealer, and mapping out every step in his mind. The night of the attack, the moon was hidden behind dark clouds. Javier approached the estate like a ghost, cutting the barbed wire with his machete and eliminating 2 guards with silent shots. He poured gasoline around the perimeter, leaving a trail connecting the secondary buildings to the main house. Then he placed the explosives at strategic points: the garage, the back entrance, a fuel tank feeding the generators. When everything was ready, he hid among the trees and waited. The meeting was in full swing. Through the windows he could see El Tigre, a burly man with a laugh that echoed like thunder, surrounded by a dozen armed men. They were drinking, smoking, planning how to divide the territory they thought they had secured by eliminating Javier. He smiled from the shadows. They had no idea what was coming. He struck the first match and threw it onto the gasoline trail. Flames instantly erupted, racing along the ground like fiery serpents. The guards outside shouted, running towards the fire. But then the explosives detonated. The garage exploded in a fireball, sending chunks of metal flying. The back entrance collapsed, trapping several men inside. The fuel tank was the final blow, a massive explosion that shook the earth and engulfed the main house in flames. Javier heard the screams, saw the silhouettes running in panic, and felt a cold satisfaction course through him. El Tigre stumbled out of the house, clothes burning, face covered in blood. Javier intercepted him before he could reach the gate, knocking him down with a blow from his rifle. "You left me in the jungle," he said, his voice sharp as a blade.